going to be a red wave like you've never seen before, because people are tired of looking at the anarchists and all of the things taking place in Portland, Chicago, New York with crime. They're tired of it. But you're going to have a red wave, the likes of which you haven't seen, and everybody knows it.
U.S. President Donald Trump speaking to reporters within the last hour. He was on his way to a rally in Wisconsin with just 10 days to go before the vote. Earlier in the day, the president voted for, quote, a guy named Trump in his adopted home of Florida, and he is among more than 54 million Americans who have already cast early ballots at a record-setting pace ahead of November 3rd. For more on the early voting and the race for the White House, we've reached Cal Jilson in Dallas. He's a political scientist with Southern Methodist University, and he joins me now. Hi there, sir. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be with you.
Great. So COVID-19 is certainly changing a lot of parts of life, and it's certainly leading to a lot of early votes. Some people concerned about safety risk around voting on the day of the election. But what signals are you seeing that we could be in for a real swell in overall voter turnout?
Well, I think we had about 139 million votes cast in 2016, and I think we're going to be up in the 160, 165 range. So that's an appreciable jump. So far, already about 40% of people who voted in 2016 have cast ballots. So we're going to get more than half, maybe up towards 60% of the vote early rather than on Election Day.
And when we're looking at Texas in particular, we see that that state has already cast ballots of around 5 million votes. That's more than half of the state's voter turnout in 2016. What dynamic do you think in particular may be contributing to people rushing to vote early there in Texas?
Well, I think there's a lot of energy in Texas and around the country swirling around Donald Trump. Republicans are working very hard to win him a second term. But Democrats and most independents, I think, are working just as hard to send him back to Mar-a-Lago. So this is an election in the U.S. with a lot of energy on both sides. The early vote seems to be leaning toward the Democrats, but the expectation is that Election Day we'll see a surge of Republicans. So we'll see how it turns out. It looks in the national polling so far that Biden is up 8 or 9 points. It's closer in some of the swing states, but you'd have to say it's advantage Biden at this point.
We've seen a shift in rhetoric from the president just the last couple days, now talking about the oil industry very specifically, and that obviously coming from the debate where Joe Biden had mentioned his push for renewable energy. How do you think that might shift the race when prior to this, so many Americans were looking at this election as a referendum on his handling of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think they still are looking at it as a referendum on his handling of the pandemic and the economy. But certainly very late in that last debate, Joe Biden misspoke and said essentially he was going to shut down the oil and gas industry, and then he cleaned it up to say that he was just going to remove federal subsidies. I don't think that's going to have a dramatic effect. If it would have an effect anywhere, it would be in Texas. But I think even the major oil company executives at this point understand that there'll be a transition over the next 3 decades or so away from oil and gas, certainly away from oil, not so much gas in the beginning, and toward renewable energy. So I don't think that that would frighten as many people as it might have, say, a decade ago.
I know that you mentioned that mail-in ballots right now are looking like they're coming from more Democrat voters, and on Election Day you anticipated that we would see more Republicans out in the polls. But if we get a huge voter turnout in the United States, which candidate is set to win overall, seeing that bigger voter turnout?
Well, I think that would be the Democrats. The Republicans in 2016, for example, that was a relatively modest turnout of around 50% of eligible voters. And President Trump just squeaked in our Electoral College, even though he lost the popular vote. As the popular vote goes up and people who don't normally vote find themselves at the polls, that tends to be advantage Democrats. But Trump did very well in 2016 among non-college white men in particular. whites in general in the Midwest. And so a high turnout might bring out some more of those. But in general, you would expect that unusually high turnout would be advantaged Democrats.
Again today, as Donald Trump was casting his vote in person in Florida, he railed against mail-in voting and the fairness of the election. This is obviously something that he has said routinely over the past number of days and weeks. How do you think that narrative might impact the election?
Well, I think that what Donald Trump is doing is setting a preposition for a complaint. On Election Day, if he appears to have lost the election, he'll claim that there was massive fraud. That's why many Americans are hoping for a decisive election one way or the other so that we don't get fraud claims. And, you know, mail balloting has happened in the U.S. since the Civil War. And 5 states in the West have voted all by mail ballot for many years. And there are other states that mailed ballots to all registered voters this time around because of COVID. So mail ballots do have a history of some minor corruption, but minor is the key word here. So it's not that corruption is rampant among mail balloting. I think it's just Trump trying to set the stage for a complaint that he lost because of corruption in mail ballots.
Interesting stuff. Thank you very much for all your analysis, Cal.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Cal Jilson is a political scientist with Southern Methodist University.